Richard Hale stepped out of the marble lobby of his company's headquarters, his mind still buzzing from the tension of the boardroom. Night had settled over downtown Atlanta, and the air carried a crisp bite, the kind that made every breath sting slightly. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he walked toward his waiting car, distracted, tired, and ready to retreat to the silence of his sprawling home in Buckhead. Then he heard it. A piercing cry, cutting through the murmur of traffic and the chatter of people heading home after work. It was not the kind of sound one could mistake. It was desperate, raw, and filled with fear. Richard froze, his chest tightening. The voice of a boy echoed from the side street near a line of police vans. "Don't let them take her. Please, don't let them take her." For a moment he hesitated. It wasn't his business. He had learned long ago to stay clear of public drama. Yet something about the plea pulled at him in a way he couldn't ignore. The tone reminded him of himself as a child, small and powerless, begging someone, anyone, to listen. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss powerful stories like this one. Richard adjusted his coat and walked toward the sound. His driver called after him, confused, but Richard waved him off. The narrow street glowed under harsh fluorescent lights mounted on the side of the precinct building. A crowd had gathered, murmuring in uneasy tones. At the center, a boy no older than 11 clung to the side of a police van, his small fists pounding against the metal as two officers tried to pull him back. The boy's face was streaked with tears, his voice hoarse from shouting. "Don't take her. She didn't do anything." Richard's eyes followed the boy's desperate gaze. Inside the van, through the barred window, sat a woman in handcuffs, her eyes locked on her son. She looked exhausted, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled, her hair pulled back in haste. Even as the officers prepared to shut the doors, her gaze never left the boy, silently begging him to stay calm. "Sir, step back!" one of the officers barked at Richard as he drew closer. Richard didn't flinch. He lowered his voice, keeping it steady. "What's happening here? Why is this child crying like that?" "It's none of your concern," the officer replied sharply, gripping the boy by the shoulders. The child struggled, twisting and shouting louder, his small voice cracking with pain. Richard knelt slightly, putting himself at the boy's eye level. "Hey, what's your name?" he asked gently. The boy blinked through his tears, suspicious of this stranger in a tailored suit. "Jamal," he whispered before crying out again. "Don't let them take my mom." The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably. Some pulled out their phones, recording. Others just shook their heads, muttering that it was a shame. Richard felt heat rising in his chest. He turned back to the officers. "Why are you arresting her?" "She's a suspect in a theft investigation," the older officer said flatly. "Step back, sir." "This isn't your concern." Richard studied Jamal's trembling frame, the way his fingers dug into the van as if letting go would mean losing everything. He saw the fear in the woman's eyes, not for herself, but for her son. Something inside Richard broke loose, an old memory of his daughter as a child, crying in a hospital hallway while he arrived too late. The echo of that guilt pushed him forward. "This doesn't look right," Richard said firmly, his voice carrying weight. "A child should not be watching his mother dragged away like this without explanation." The officers exchanged annoyed glances, clearly unsettled by the presence of a man who didn't look like the usual bystander. The younger one, a woman with sharp eyes, hesitated as if she shared his doubt. Richard placed a steadying hand on Jamal's shoulder. "I'm here, son. You're not alone." The boy's sobs softened just slightly, though his grip on the van did not loosen. His voice cracked once more, filled with a mixture of fear and stubbornness. "Please, don't let them take her." Richard knew in that moment he was already involved, and he would not walk away. Richard walked away from the police van only after Jamal was pulled aside by the younger officer, who seemed less inclined to use force. He promised the boy he would come back, then headed toward a nearby bench under the glow of a flickering streetlight. His pulse was still pounding, and the sound of Jamal's voice echoed in his mind. That cry had pierced something old, something buried. He leaned back against the cold iron of the bench, closing his eyes for a moment. His life had been defined by boardrooms, contracts, and the weight of decisions that shaped entire industries. But before all the accolades, before the wealth, Richard Hale had been nothing more than the son of a struggling mechanic in Macon, Georgia. He remembered nights when his father came home with grease-stained hands and a temper worn thin by exhaustion. His mother worked shifts at a diner, serving coffee to truck drivers until her back ached. He had known what it meant to feel invisible. At 12, Richard was just another kid who carried the shame of worn-out shoes and empty lunchboxes. He remembered how he had once begged a teacher to let him stay after school so he could use the classroom heater during the winter. The teacher brushed him off, saying rules were rules. He learned early that few people listened to a poor boy's plea. It was those memories that drove him. He studied relentlessly, earned scholarships, and clawed his way into the world of business. His company, Hale Logistics, had started with nothing more than an old truck and a borrowed loan. Decades later, it had become a giant, powering distribution across the country. He became the kind of man whose signature could alter markets and whose name was spoken with a mixture of admiration and envy. Yet all that power had not saved him from the ache of personal failure. His wife, Claire, had been the grounding force in his life, the one who softened his hard edges. She had been patient when he missed anniversaries, gentle when he returned home too tired to speak. But one winter night, she collapsed suddenly, gone before he reached the hospital. Richard never forgave himself for not being there. And then there was his daughter, Emily. Once a bright-eyed teenager who looked at him as if he were a hero, she had grown into a woman who kept her distance. Years of broken promises, missed recitals, unanswered calls, had carved a wall between them. Their conversations now were polite but strained, filled with silence where laughter should have been. That was why Jamal's cry had struck so deeply. It wasn't only the sound of a boy begging for his mother. It was the echo of his own child's voice, the one he had ignored too many times. It was the memory of Emily, waiting for him at the edge of a stage, her eyes scanning the crowd for a father who never showed. Richard opened his eyes and exhaled sharply. He had built an empire but lived with the hollow knowledge that money could not mend regret. He often donated to charities, funded scholarships, and shook hands at fundraisers, but none of it erased the look in Emily's eyes the last time they spoke. Now, here was Jamal, raw, unguarded, terrified. The boy's pain stirred a question Richard had avoided for years. Could he do something that truly mattered, not for his reputation or for a headline, but for a single child who needed someone to listen? The sound of footsteps approached. Richard turned and saw Eleanor Price, his longtime assistant, hurrying across the sidewalk. She had followed him after the board meeting, concerned by his sudden disappearance. Her grey hair was pinned neatly, and her sharp eyes studied him with the precision of someone who knew his habits better than he did. "You disappeared," she said, slightly breathless. "The board is restless. Are you all right?" Richard forced a thin smile. "I heard a boy crying." Eleanor tilted her head. "And you followed it?" "Yes," he said quietly, his gaze drifting back toward the police van. "And I can't get his voice out of my head." Eleanor frowned, sensing more behind his words, but she didn't press. She knew Richard too well to expect an immediate confession. What she didn't know was that Richard Hale was already standing at the edge of a decision that would test everything he thought he understood about power, justice, and redemption. Richard rose from the bench, the weight of memory still pressing on his chest, and walked back toward the police van. Jamal was still there, though calmer now, his shoulders shaking with muffled sobs. The woman officer, her badge read Ruiz, stood nearby, keeping him from rushing forward again. The older officer, a broad man with a heavy jaw, stood with his arms crossed, as if daring anyone to challenge his authority. Richard's voice carried with a steady calmness, though inside his stomach tightened. "Officers, I'd like to know exactly what's happening here. Why is this woman being taken away in front of her son?" The older officer gave him a hard stare. "She's a suspect in a theft case. That's all you need to know. Step back and let us do our job." Jamal pulled against Officer Ruiz's hand, his small voice breaking. "She didn't steal anything. She didn't. You can't take her." Ruiz crouched slightly to look Jamal in the eye. Her voice was softer than her partner's. "Listen, we just need to ask your mum some questions. It doesn't mean anything bad yet. But even she didn't sound convinced. Richard knelt again beside Jamal, ignoring the officer's glare. "Who is she to you?" he asked gently. "My mom," Jamal whispered, his lips trembling. He turned back toward the van, where Alicia sat motionless, her face pale under the harsh light. Richard straightened and addressed the officers again. "I've heard what you've said, but dragging a woman into a van while her son screams doesn't look like due process to me." The older officer, whose name tag read Sanderson, stepped forward. His tone carried both irritation and warning. "Sir, I don't care who you are or what you think you saw. We have procedures. If you interfere again, I'll have to assume you're obstructing." Richard met his eyes without flinching. Years of negotiating billion-dollar contracts had taught him how to stand firm against intimidation. "I'm not interfering, I'm asking. Because from where I'm standing, this child deserves an answer that makes sense." Sanderson's jaw tightened. "This is none of your business." Ruiz shifted uneasily, glancing at Sanderson before speaking. "Detective, maybe we should explain. He's not wrong. People are watching." Indeed, the small crowd had grown. Several onlookers had their phones raised, recording every second. Richard noticed the tension in Sanderson's shoulders. He was a man used to control, now cornered by too many eyes. Richard lowered his voice, speaking just loud enough for the officers to hear. "Do you know who I am?" Sanderson's lip curled. "I don't care." "Good," Richard replied evenly. "Because that means this isn't about power or status. It's about right and wrong." "So tell me, what exactly did she supposedly steal?" Sanderson hesitated. "Merchandise from a store downtown. She matches the description, and we had a call." Richard's brow furrowed. "That's it? A description? Do you realize what it does to a child to see his mother treated like this over an accusation that thin?" Jamal clutched Richard's coat sleeve, his voice desperate. "Please don't let them take her, please." For a moment, silence hung between them. Ruiz's expression betrayed unease, as though she too questioned the strength of the case. Sanderson, however, stayed rigid, hiding behind protocol. Richard bent slightly toward Jamal and spoke firmly, so the boy could feel the promise in his words. "I won't walk away. Shall stay until I know what's going on." Alicia, inside the van, pressed her forehead against the bars of the window. She didn't speak, but her eyes glistened, fixed on Jamal, then shifting briefly to Richard. It was a look heavy with both fear and fragile hope. Richard exhaled slowly. He had stepped into the confrontation fully now, and though the officers might try to brush him aside, he knew there was no turning back. The day had started before sunrise for Alicia Carter. She had slipped quietly from her small apartment in East Point, careful not to wake Jamal. He was curled up on the couch with a blanket, because his bedroom window still leaked cold air despite her landlord's promises to fix it. She kissed his forehead softly before leaving, her heart heavy with the knowledge that he hated waking up without her there. By 6 a.m., she was already on her feet at Grady Memorial Hospital. The hallways smelled faintly of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. Alicia had learned to ignore the ache in her legs and the heaviness in her back. 12-hour shifts were nothing new. What made it harder was the constant worry about Jamal, if he got his homework done, if he ate enough. If the neighborhood boys teased him for the worn sneakers he wore until the soles thinned. Her co-workers admired her resilience. "Girl, I don't know how you do it," a nurse named Brenda often told her. Alicia always smiled, answering the same way. "Because I have to." And it was true. Every chart she filled, every patient she guided through recovery, was one more step toward keeping Jamal safe, housed, and fed. By evening, fatigue pressed against her temples. She clocked out late, as usual, after covering a double shift. Jamal had been waiting with the neighbor until she returned. She drove home in her old sedan, the heater broken, the windshield fogging. Through the blur of exhaustion, she thought about bills, about rent, about how Jamal had asked if he could try out for the robotics club at school. The cost of supplies felt like another mountain, but she promised him she would find a way. She barely had time to set her bag down at home when the knock came. It wasn't friendly. 2 officers stood at her door, their voices stern, asking her name. Confused, Alicia answered honestly, only for them to tell her she matched the description of a shoplifter at a department store downtown. Her chest tightened. "That's a mistake," she said firmly. "I just came from the hospital. I was working all day. You can check, my supervisors will confirm." But her protest seemed to fall into a void. The older detective's eyes didn't soften. His partner looked uncertain, but neither stopped the process. Jamal ran out from the couch, panic spreading across his face. "Mom, what's happening?" he cried, his voice trembling. Alicia bent quickly, holding his shoulders. "It's all right, baby. It's just a misunderstanding. I'll be back soon." She tried to sound confident, but her heart was hammering. Jamal clung to her arm, his grip desperate. "No, you didn't do anything. They can't take you." The officers pulled her gently but firmly toward the door. The hallway outside was dim, the sound of her son's cries echoing painfully. Neighbors peeked through half-closed doors, whispering. Shame burned through her, not because she was guilty, but because appearances mattered in a world where a black woman in scrubs could so easily be mistaken for a criminal. In the van, her wrists cuffed, Alicia sat in stunned silence. She replayed every second, searching for logic. She had receipts from groceries, her hospital ID badge, proof of her shift hours. None of it mattered right then. What mattered was Jamal's face, his tears, his scream of protest. She pressed her forehead against the cold bars of the window, straining to keep her eyes on him as officers tried to pull him back. "Don't let them take her," his voice cracked. The sound cut through her like glass. She wanted to comfort him, to say the words that always calmed him. "I'm here, Jamal. I'll fix it." But this time she had no control. As the van door inched closer to shutting, Alicia whispered a prayer under her breath. Not for herself, but for her son. That someone would hear him, that someone would see his pain. And in that moment, her gaze landed on a stranger in a dark coat, Richard Hale, who had stepped out from the crowd, his eyes fixed on her son. For the first time that night, Alicia felt a flicker of something other than fear. Richard had never been the kind of man to stay on the sidelines when something gnawed at his conscience. Standing near the van, he tightened his jaw and pulled his phone from his coat pocket. If this woman was being held on nothing more than suspicion, there had to be a way to intervene legally and quickly. He dialed a number he rarely used, except in situations where influence mattered. Within minutes, his attorney, a polished man named Gregory Klein, answered. Richard's voice was clipped, urgent. "Gregory, I need you at the precinct downtown. A woman is being arrested in front of her son. Her name is Alicia Carter. Find out what the charges are and post bail immediately." Gregory hesitated. "Richard, if she hasn't been booked yet, bail isn't even on the table. They'll process her first. Then call whoever you have to. I don't care how much it costs. Just make it happen." Richard ended the call, his frustration bubbling. He turned to Detective Sanderson, who was now instructing another officer to drive the van. Richard stepped forward. "I'm willing to cover bail right now. There's no need to drag her through this spectacle in front of her son." Sanderson gave him a flat look. "That's not how it works. She has to be processed like everyone else. Money doesn't change procedure." Richard's temper flared. "Are you telling me you'd rather traumatize a child than accept a solution standing right in front of you?" The detective's voice hardened. "What I'm telling you is that you don't run this department. She'll go through intake like anyone else." The words stung because they stripped Richard of the shield he usually carried, his wealth, his status, the ease with which doors opened when his name appeared on paperwork. Here it meant nothing. Jamal clung to Richard's side, his small hand gripping the sleeve of his coat. "Can't you stop them, please?" His wide, tear-filled eyes made Richard's chest tighten painfully. He crouched down to meet the boy's gaze. "I'm trying, Jamal. I promise I'm trying. But right now, they're not listening to me." Jamal's lip quivered. "They never listen." The words landed heavier than Richard expected. They carried the weight of someone who had learned too early that voices like his often went unheard. Richard wanted to tell him that wasn't true, but even he doubted it in this moment. Officer Ruiz shifted uncomfortably. She looked at Richard, then at Sanderson. Detective, maybe we should consider alternatives. The kid... Sanderson cut her off. Ruiz, stand down. We follow procedure. Richard straightened, his frustration simmering. So that's it? You'll march her into a holding cell while this boy stands here believing the world is stacked against him? Sanderson's expression didn't waver. That's not my concern. Richard's hand curled into a fist at his side. The helplessness was foreign, almost unbearable. He was used to closing deals with a signature, solving problems with a call, removing obstacles with resources others could only dream of. But here, confronted with bureaucracy and indifference, his influence was stripped bare. The van engine rumbled to life. Jamal panicked, tugging at Richard's sleeve again. Don't let them take her. Please don't let them. His cries rose higher, piercing the night air once more. Richard placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, steady but heavy with his own frustration. Listen to me. This isn't the end. I will not let her disappear into that system without a fight. Do you hear me? Jamal nodded shakily, though his tears didn't stop. Richard turned his gaze back to the van, his jaw clenched. Alicia's eyes were still locked on her son. In that fleeting connection, Richard saw both her strength and her desperation. He couldn't fix it now, but he knew this was only the beginning. For the first time in years, Richard Hale felt powerless. And yet, beneath that powerlessness, something else stirred. Resolve. After the van disappeared into the night, Richard remained with Jamal on the steps of the precinct. The boy's sobs had quieted, but he trembled, clutching his backpack to his chest as if it were armor. The crowd that had gathered earlier slowly dispersed, leaving behind only the faint hum of traffic and the harsh glow of the streetlights. Richard sat beside him, unsure of how to begin. He wasn't used to consoling children. He had failed at that with his own daughter, and the weight of that failure pressed on him now. Still, something in Jamal's silence compelled him to try. Jamal, he said softly, I know tonight feels impossible, but I promise your mum isn't gone. I'll help you. The boy turned his face away, his voice hoarse. You don't even know her. Why would you help us? Richard paused. It was a fair question. Because I know what it's like to feel like nobody listens, and because sometimes a stranger has to step in when the world turns its back. Jamal studied him through swollen eyes, as if searching for a lie. He found none, but trust wasn't easy for him. People always say they'll help, Jamal muttered. Then they forget. Richard felt the sting of those words. They echoed his daughter's last sharp comment to him during a strained holiday dinner. You're always too busy, Dad. You only show up when it's convenient. He inhaled slowly, steadying his voice. I won't forget. You have my word. For a moment neither spoke. The night air was thick with the scent of exhaust and damp concrete. Richard shifted slightly, leaning forward. Tell me about your mum. What's she like? Jamal clutched his backpack tighter, but his voice softened. She works all the time. At the hospital, she takes care of people even when she's tired. She always makes sure I eat first, even if she doesn't, and she believes I can do anything. Even when kids at school laugh because I don't have new stuff. The pride in his tone surprised Richard, even as his throat tightened. Jamal's love for his mother radiated with every word. She sounds like someone very special, Richard said quietly. She is, Jamal replied firmly, a spark of defiance in his voice. She didn't steal anything. She doesn't even have time to go shopping. Richard nodded. I believe you and I believe her. That's why we're going to make sure the truth comes out. Jamal's eyes flicked toward him, cautious but curious. Why do you care so much? You're rich, aren't you? You don't look like people from around here. Richard gave a faint smile. I am fortunate, yes. But that doesn't mean I don't see what's in front of me. Money doesn't make you blind, at least it shouldn't. Jamal bit his lip, wrestling with emotions bigger than his small frame. Finally he whispered, Do you have kids? The question struck Richard like a blade. He hesitated before answering. I have a daughter. We don't see each other much anymore. Jamal tilted his head. Why not? Richard swallowed hard. Because I made mistakes. I wasn't there when she needed me, and I'd give anything to change that. The boy looked at him differently then, not with pity, but with recognition. So you know what it feels like when someone's not there. Richard's voice cracked slightly. Yes, I know it too well. The words bridged something fragile between them. Jamal leaned closer, resting his head against Richard's arm. It was hesitant at first, then steady, like a child testing whether the ground beneath him was safe. Richard didn't move away. He let the boy rest there, the weight both light and heavy at once. In that moment he realized trust wasn't given. It was earned piece by piece in silence and honesty. And tonight, he had taken the first step. Richard guided Jamal into the lobby of the precinct, a space that smelled of stale coffee and worn linoleum. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed faintly, giving everything a washed-out tone. Jamal clutched his backpack tightly, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar place. Richard sat him down on a wooden bench, then stepped aside to make a call. Eleanor answered on the second ring. "Richard? It's late. Where did you disappear to after the meeting?" Richard rubbed his temple, lowering his voice. "I'm at the downtown precinct. A woman was just arrested in front of her son. It didn't feel right, Eleanor. Something about it?" He trailed off, glancing back at Jamal, who sat hunched over, shoulders shaking quietly. "The boy is terrified. He has no one here." There was a pause on the other end before Eleanor spoke, her tone sharp with concern. "And you're involving yourself?" "I couldn't walk away," Richard admitted. "I tried to post bail, but they wouldn't allow it until she's processed. Bureaucracy, red tape, whatever you want to call it." "Meanwhile, this kid thinks the world just ended." Eleanor sighed, the sound of rustling papers in the background. "Richard, listen to me. You've spent your life solving problems with money and influence. But this isn't a contract negotiation or a board vote. This is messy, human, and the system doesn't bend just because you want it to." "I know that," he said, his voice heavier than he intended. "But what am I supposed to do? Watch this boy crumble in front of me?" "You stay," Eleanor replied firmly. "You sit with him. You let him know someone cares. That matters more than any check you can write. Trust me." Richard leaned against the cold wall, the weight of her words settling deep. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that, Eleanor. I failed at being there for my own daughter." Eleanor's tone softened, though it carried the steel of someone who had stood by his side for decades. "Maybe that's exactly why you are the right person. You know what regret feels like. Don't let it win again." Richard closed his eyes briefly, remembering Emily's distant gaze the last time they spoke. "You think I can actually help him?" "I think," Eleanor said gently, "that for once you need to stop trying to fix everything with solutions and just be present. Sometimes presence is the only thing that heals." Silence hung for a moment before Richard exhaled. "All right, I'll stay. I won't leave him alone tonight." "That's all you can do right now," Eleanor answered. "And Richard, be patient. Trust takes time. Don't expect the boy to see you as a savior. Just let him see you as someone who won't vanish." Richard ended the call and slipped the phone back into his coat pocket. Jamal looked up at him, his eyes swollen and red. "Are they going to let her go?" Richard sat beside him. "Not tonight, but your mom has people who care about her now." "I've already called someone to help." Jamal hugged his backpack tighter. "People say things like that, then they leave." Richard felt those words cut into him, but he steadied his voice. "I'm not leaving, Jamal. Not tonight. I'll be right here until we know more." The boy studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to believe him. Then, quietly, he leaned against Richard's side. It wasn't full trust yet, but it was a start. As the precinct buzzed with the movement of officers, paperwork, and weary families, Richard realized Eleanor was right. This wasn't about power, not tonight. It was about being the one person who didn't walk away. Hours passed and the precinct grew heavier with the weight of waiting. Richard sat with Jamal on the hard wooden bench, watching people come and go. The lobby buzzed with a strange mixture of fatigue and tension, phones ringing, clerks stamping papers, families whispering prayers under their breath. It was a place that seemed built to wear people down. Jamal leaned against him, silent now, his small hands fidgeting with the zipper of his backpack. Richard studied the boy's face and saw exhaustion etched into it, a kind of weariness that no child should carry. Across the room, A woman paced with her teenage son, her voice sharp with worry. "We can't afford another lawyer," she whispered. "If they don't drop this, I don't know what we'll do." The boy stared at the floor, ashamed. Nearby, a man in work boots argued with a clerk about his brother being held without clear charges. "They said he'd be out by now. You keep changing the story." His frustration boiled, but the clerk simply shrugged, drowning him in red tape. Richard felt the scenes pressing on him. This wasn't the sleek efficiency of boardrooms where every action had a measurable outcome. This was chaos disguised as procedure, a system so tangled that it crushed people quietly. Jamal tugged at his sleeve. "Is it always like this?" Richard looked down. "Like what?" "Like nobody cares." Richard hesitated. He wanted to reassure the boy, but honesty forced its way through. "Sometimes it feels that way, but not everyone is blind, Jamal. There are people who fight back." The boy didn't respond, but his eyes lingered on the families around them, the weight of his own question unanswered. Richard rose and walked to the vending machine. He bought 2 bottles of water and a pack of crackers, returning to sit beside Jamal. He handed them over. Jamal muttered, "Thanks," before nibbling quietly. After a pause, he asked, "Why are you still here? You could have left hours ago." Richard took a breath, his gaze fixed on the tired faces in the room. "Because leaving would make me no different from the people who ignored me when I was your age. I know what it feels like to need someone and have no one show up." Jamal studied him, the question lingering in his eyes. Is he telling the truth? Richard let the silence hold, not trying to sell himself, just being there. A man in a wrinkled suit sat across from them, clearly a public defender. He looked drained, his tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. Richard watched him juggle 3 phone calls and 2 different families at once. Each plea he answered carried the same tired refrain. "I'll try. The backlog is heavy. Nothing moves fast here." The sight hit Richard harder than expected. He'd built a life where speed was everything. Deliveries on time, contracts closed in hours, fortunes shifting in seconds. But here, time was a weapon. Delay was a punishment. And families like Jamal's bore the brunt of it. Jamal finished the crackers and leaned back, his voice small. "Do you think my mom is scared right now?" Richard's throat tightened. "Yes, but she's also thinking of you. She's strong, Jamal. Stronger than most people I've ever met. Don't forget that." The boy hugged his backpack to his chest, holding the words close. Richard exhaled, realizing something profound. For all his money, he couldn't bend this place to his will. Influence meant little when drowned in the machinery of a system designed to grind slowly. All he could do tonight was keep his word, to stay, to witness, to refuse to let Jamal endure this silence alone. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Richard felt the full weight of the system pressing down, and for the first time he understood just how deep he would have to go to make a difference. Detective Mark Sanderson sat at his cluttered desk, staring at the paperwork he had just signed. His pen hovered above the page, tapping nervously against the margin. He had done this process thousands of times: intake, charges, reports, signatures. But tonight, something gnawed at him. The description from the department store was vague. A black woman in scrubs, medium build, early 30s. That could have fit dozens of women leaving the hospital district at the same time. Yet Alicia Carter was the one they had pulled in. Sanderson had followed protocol, but the boy's cries still echoed in his head, louder than the voice of procedure. Ruiz approached, her face drawn with unease. She placed a folder on his desk. "Detective, I looked at the timeline. The report says the theft happened around 6:15. Carter clocked out of Grady Memorial at 6:20. That doesn't add up." Sanderson frowned. "Maybe she left early. Maybe the report's timestamp was off. We see that all the time." Ruiz shook her head. "Or maybe we've got the wrong person." He leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Listen, Ruiz, you're new. You don't understand how messy these things get. We don't get paid to doubt every detail. We follow leads. Let the system sort the rest." Her eyes hardened. "And in the meantime, a kid thinks his mother's a criminal. You heard him. Do you even believe she did it?" The question landed heavy. Sanderson avoided her gaze. He thought about the years he'd worn the badge, the promises he made when he was young, to protect, to serve, to do what was right. Over time, those ideals had dulled under piles of reports and unending shifts. But still, deep down, he hadn't forgotten them. Belief isn't part of the process, he muttered, though the words felt hollow. Ruiz didn't move. It should be. After she walked away, Sanderson sat in silence, staring at the stack of cases on his desk. His chest tightened. He thought about his own daughter, Hannah, who was close to Jamal's age. What would she think if she saw him tonight, dragging another child's mother away over a flimsy accusation? He opened his drawer and pulled out a framed photo. Hannah grinning with a missing front tooth, her arm wrapped around their family dog. He ran a thumb over the glass, guilt swelling. Richard Hale's face came back to him too, the sharp confidence, the way he spoke not as a man demanding special treatment, but as someone outraged by what he was witnessing. Most wealthy men Sanderson had dealt with were arrogant, entitled, but Hale had looked haunted, determined. Sanderson rubbed his temples. His career had been built on following orders, but every instinct screamed that this case was wrong. Still, what could he do? Speak out now, and he risked not only embarrassment but discipline. The brass didn't like when officers second-guessed arrests. Doubt was seen as weakness, yet doubt was all he had tonight. A voice startled him. "Detective, we've got media outside. Some of the crowd filmed the arrest." Sanderson cursed under his breath. The department hated headlines that questioned integrity. If this went public, the narrative could spin out of control. He thought about Ruiz's words, about the clock times not lining up, about the boy's desperate eyes. For the first time in a long while, Sanderson felt the weight of the badge press harder than ever. He had sworn an oath, not to paperwork, not to protocol, to justice. He closed the folder and pushed it aside, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. His voice was low but certain as he muttered to himself, "Something about this doesn't add up." And for the first time that night, he knew he couldn't bury that feeling. Morning light filtered through the precinct windows, washing the lobby in pale grey. Richard had not left Jamal's side all night. His body ached from the hard bench, but the boy's quiet breathing against his arm had anchored him there. When Jamal finally stirred awake, Richard offered him a tired smile. "Today, we take the first step." Gregory Klein, his attorney, arrived shortly after. Polished as always in a crisp navy suit and gleaming shoes, Gregory carried himself like a man who had walked these halls countless times. He adjusted his glasses and looked around with faint disapproval. "Richard, this is not exactly your arena, but I've reviewed what little information they've provided. The case is thin. Embarrassingly so." "Then get her out," Richard said bluntly. Gregory lifted a hand. "Patience, the hearing is set for this afternoon, that's when we'll push." "Until then, there's no magic button." Jamal tugged at Richard's sleeve, his voice nervous. "What's a hearing?" Richard crouched beside him, keeping his tone calm. "It's when a judge listens to what the police say and what our lawyer says. It's the first chance to show your mum's side. Will she come home after?" Jamal's eyes searched Richard's face for certainty. Richard hesitated, then steadied his voice. "That's what we're fighting for." Later that day they sat inside a small courtroom. The walls were lined with scuffed wood, and the air carried the sterile chill of authority. Alicia was led in, still in her scrubs, her wrists free but her posture heavy with exhaustion. The moment her eyes found Jamal's, her face softened, though worry lingered behind the smile she forced for him. The prosecutor, a sharp man with a clipped tone, recited the charge: theft of merchandise valued at a few $100s. "She matches the description given by store personnel," he declared. "Flight risk should be considered." Gregory rose smoothly, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the description is vague at best. A woman in scrubs, medium build, early 30s. My client is one of hundreds of women who fit that description in Atlanta on any given evening. Furthermore, she was working a hospital shift during the alleged time of theft. Documentation has already been submitted." The judge leaned forward. "Is that correct?" Gregory handed over time-stamped records from Grady Memorial. "Clear evidence she was on duty at 6:15. The accusation falls apart under basic scrutiny." The prosecutor faltered but pressed on. We still believe she should be held pending further investigation. Richard clenched his jaw. He wanted to stand, to shout that this was madness. But Gregory's steady hand signaled him to remain quiet. This was his battlefield now. The judge reviewed the paperwork in silence. Jamal's small hand squeezed Richard's tightly, his knuckles white. Richard bent his head slightly and whispered, "Stay strong. She needs to see you strong." Finally, the judge looked up. "Given the documentation, I find the state's evidence insufficient for holding without bail. Bail is set at $5,000. Richard didn't wait. "Done," he said firmly, his voice echoing across the room. Gregory gave the clerk a crisp nod, already preparing the paperwork. Relief flickered across Alicia's face, but it was tempered by fear. She knew too well that bail was only a temporary reprieve. The fight was far from over. As the session ended, Jamal darted forward, hugging his mother tightly before officers intervened to guide her back for processing. Tears welled in his eyes. "I thought they'd keep you forever," he whispered against her. Alicia stroked his hair, whispering back, "I told you, baby. I'll come back." "I'm not giving up." Richard watched, his chest heavy. For all his influence, he had only nudged open the first door. Beyond it lay a maze of obstacles that no amount of money could sweep aside overnight. Still, as he saw Jamal clinging to his mother, he knew retreat was no longer an option. The battle had just begun. When Alicia finally stepped out of the precinct later that evening, the cool air hit her face like a reminder of freedom, even if temporary. Jamal rushed into her arms, nearly knocking her off balance. She held him tight, breathing him in, feeling his small heartbeat thumping against her chest. Richard stood a few feet away, giving them space, but his presence lingered like a steady anchor. Alicia looked up at him after a long moment, her expression a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly, still holding Jamal close. Richard nodded. "I know, but I couldn't stand by and watch. You don't deserve what happened." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Plenty of people don't deserve what happens to them. "You can't fix it all." "No," he admitted, "but I can try to fix this." They walked together toward the curb, where Richard's driver had been waiting. He gestured toward the car. "Let me take you home. You and Jamal both need rest." Alicia shook her head firmly. "No, we'll take the bus. I don't want to owe you." Richard blinked at her resistance. "It's not about owing me. It's about safety." "You've been through enough today." Her voice sharpened. "Exactly. And I won't let my son grow up thinking someone else has to rescue us. We've survived because I work, because I stand on my own 2 feet. I can't let him see me as someone who depends on charity." Jamal looked between them, his small hand tightening around hers. "Mom?" Richard lowered his voice, careful not to sound like he was pressing. "I don't see you as charity, Alicia. I see you as someone caught in a system that doesn't play fair, and I'm offering what I can because I have the means, not out of pity, out of respect." Her eyes narrowed as if weighing his sincerity. "Respect doesn't erase the fact that you're a stranger. And strangers don't usually fight this hard unless they want something." Richard felt the sting of her words. "I don't want anything from you, except maybe a chance to prove that not all strangers walk away." Silence stretched between them. Alicia studied him, looking for the cracks, the hidden motive. She found only exhaustion in his face and an odd sort of regret behind his eyes. That disarmed her more than she cared to admit. Still, her pride burned. "We'll take the bus," she repeated, though her tone had softened. Richard didn't argue further. He respected her defiance, even if it left him uneasy. He simply handed Jamal a small card with his number on it. "If anything happens, call me day or night." No explanations needed. Jamal tucked the card into his backpack carefully, as though it was something precious. Alicia noticed, but she didn't scold him. She only exhaled sharply, her shoulders heavy with the burden of appearing unbreakable. As the bus pulled up, Richard stood back, watching mother and son climb aboard. Jamal glanced through the window as they found seats, his eyes catching Richard's. He gave the faintest nod, almost a promise. Richard raised a hand in return, a silent vow that this wouldn't be the end of his help, even if Alicia's pride made it difficult. The bus rumbled away, leaving Richard on the sidewalk with the city lights flickering above him. He understood her resistance. Pride was her shield, the only thing she had to keep her dignity intact in a world eager to strip it away. But he also knew shields grew heavy, and eventually even the strongest needed someone to stand beside them. For now, she had let him in only a fraction. But that fraction was enough to keep him fighting. By the next morning, Richard woke to a barrage of calls and messages. His phone buzzed relentlessly, his inbox overflowing. The headlines were already spreading. Millionaire confronts police during arrest of single mother. Another outlet framed it more harshly. Business mogul meddles in ongoing investigation. Eleanor stormed into his office, phone in hand, her sharp eyes narrowed. Well, you've done it now. You're all over the news. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. It was bound to get out, too many people were recording. Eleanor dropped her phone on his desk, the screen glowing with a clip of him kneeling beside Jamal, promising he wouldn't walk away. They're playing this everywhere. Half the comments praise you, call you a hero. The other half say you're grandstanding, using this family to polish your image. Richard frowned. That's not why I did it. I know, Eleanor said, her tone softening. But the world doesn't care about intentions. They'll twist it, however it fits their story. Later that afternoon, Richard walked into the boardroom for a scheduled meeting. The tension was thick. His executives sat stiffly, their expressions strained. One of them, a man named Douglas Reed, spoke first. Richard, your involvement with this case is creating noise. Investors don't like uncertainty. Richard folded his hands on the table. So they'd prefer I stand by and let a child watch his mother be dragged away unfairly. Douglas cleared his throat. That's not the point. Our company thrives on stability. You can make donations, fund charities quietly, but appearing in viral videos at police vans, it makes us look reckless. Another board member chimed in. The media frenzy could damage our negotiations in Chicago. We can't afford distractions. Richard's gaze hardened. If standing up for someone being mistreated is a distraction, then maybe we're measuring the wrong things. The room fell into uneasy silence. His words carried weight, but not comfort. He could feel the divide between those who valued profit margins above all else and the quiet few who looked at him with a flicker of respect. Meanwhile, Alicia was facing her own storm. Outside her apartment, reporters had gathered, shouting questions as she left for work. Did the millionaire pay you to cooperate? One called out. Do you believe he's exploiting your case for publicity? Another asked. Alicia kept her head down, gripping Jamal's hand tightly as they hurried past. Her face burned with humiliation, though her voice stayed firm when she finally spoke to him. Don't answer. Don't look at them. They don't know us. But inside, her pride twisted painfully. She had spent years keeping her life private, protecting Jamal from pity. Now strangers debated her innocence on television. That evening, Richard called her. She answered reluctantly, her voice taut. Why are there cameras outside my home? They followed the story, Richard said quietly. It wasn't my intention. Intentions don't matter, Alicia shot back. My son has to walk through a crowd of strangers just to get to school. Do you know what that feels like? Richard closed his eyes. Yes, I know what it feels like to have your family exposed in ways you can't control. Her silence on the other end told him she wasn't ready to believe that yet. After hanging up, Richard stared out his office window at the city skyline. He had wanted to help, not to put her under a spotlight, yet once again, his name had turned into both a shield and a weapon. Still, beneath the noise, he knew one truth. This case wasn't about his reputation. It was about Alicia and Jamal, and no matter what the world said, he couldn't step back now. Detective Sanderson sat in his car outside the precinct, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. For days he had fought to silence the unease gnawing at him. Tonight, he could no longer ignore it. In his passenger seat lay a folder he wasn't supposed to have, copies of surveillance logs, statements, and one document that chilled him, a memo from the store's manager noting pressure to make an example of suspected theft. The timestamps clashed with Alicia's shift records. Someone had twisted details to fit her into the frame. He muttered under his breath, "Damn it, this isn't right." Ruiz had been right from the beginning. The case smelled wrong. Sanderson knew if he pushed further, he'd be stepping into dangerous waters. Superiors didn't appreciate officers who questioned convenient arrests, especially when media heat was already burning. But then he saw Jamal's tear-streaked face in his mind again, heard that voice begging, "Don't let them take her." He shoved the folder into his jacket and marched inside. Meanwhile, Richard sat with Gregory in his office, exhaustion pulling at him, but determination keeping him upright. "We need more than timestamps," he insisted. "They'll keep stalling unless we force the truth into the open." Gregory adjusted his glasses. "You're right. The prosecution won't fold easily. They'll drag it out, hoping public attention fades." Richard slammed his palm against the desk. "I won't let that happen." A knock interrupted them. When the door opened, Detective Sanderson stepped in, his presence heavy with conflict. Gregory stiffened immediately. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" Richard asked coolly. Sanderson closed the door behind him. His voice was rough, as though scraped by guilt. "I have something you need to see, but if I hand this over, my career might not survive." Gregory eyed the folder in Sanderson's grip. "You realize what you're implying?" "I realize exactly what I'm implying," Sanderson shot back. "Your client was framed. The store manager filed a false report. I found internal notes. They needed someone to blame for a series of thefts, and Alicia Carter was a convenient target." Richard's chest tightened. "Why bring this to me? Why not go to your superiors?" Sanderson gave a bitter laugh. "Because they don't want the truth. They want quiet. If I bring this up, they'll bury it and bury me with it. But you—" He met Richard's gaze firmly. "You have the power to make sure it can't be ignored." Gregory reached for the folder, flipping through the pages quickly. His expression darkened. "This is damning. Chain of custody notes missing, inconsistent witness statements, and those memos." He looked at Sanderson. "If this is authentic, it could collapse the case." "It's authentic," Sanderson said. "I put my badge on it." Richard leaned forward. "Then why do I feel like you're hesitating?" Sanderson's jaw clenched. "Because once this goes public, I'll be finished. Transferred to some desk job in the basement, if not fired outright. I've got a daughter of my own. I need this job." The room fell into silence. Richard studied him, seeing not just an officer, but a father torn between survival and doing what was right. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low but unwavering. "You already made your choice when you walked in here tonight. You couldn't ignore it." "Neither can I." Sanderson's shoulders sagged, the fight inside him visible. He set the folder on the desk. "Do what you have to do, just don't let them bury her." As he left, Richard looked at Gregory, who nodded grimly. "This could turn the case upside down. But brace yourself, the prosecution won't go quietly. They'll fight tooth and nail to keep this from seeing daylight." Richard glanced at the folder, then at the door where Sanderson had exited. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what was coming. The battle wasn't only about Alicia anymore. It was about exposing a system that punished the innocent to protect the powerful, and the storm was just beginning. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Alicia's case was called. Reporters lined the hallway, cameras flashing as she entered with Gregory at her side. Jamal held her hand tightly, his small frame stiff with nerves. Richard followed close behind, his presence silent but commanding. Every step a promise that he would not let her face this storm alone. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The prosecutor rose confidently, his voice sharp as he repeated the accusations. The defendant was identified by store personnel. The description matches. The arrest was justified. Gregory stood slowly, his calm deliberate. "Your Honor, what the prosecution calls identification is nothing more than guesswork. And we can prove it." He motioned toward the stack of documents Richard had brought him the night before, the very ones Sanderson had risked his career to deliver. He handed the folder to the judge. "These are internal memos from the store's management, along with time-stamped hospital records showing Ms. Carter was working during the alleged theft. The store manager himself wrote of needing a scapegoat to curb losses. My client was chosen because she fit a vague description. That is not justice. It's prejudice. The judge scanned the papers carefully. The prosecutor shifted uneasily, his earlier confidence faltering. Your Honor, we object to the introduction of these documents. Their chain of custody is questionable. Gregory cut in smoothly. They were obtained by an officer of the law who could not, in good conscience, allow an innocent woman to be railroaded. If the prosecution is concerned about authenticity, I welcome a full investigation. But in the meantime, this case cannot proceed on smoke and mirrors. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Alicia gripped Jamal's hand tighter, her breath shallow. She dared not believe yet, but hope flickered in her chest. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. His voice carried weight. The evidence presented here casts serious doubt on the prosecution's case. This court will not serve as a tool for scapegoating. Charges against Alicia Carter are dismissed. The words landed like thunder. Jamal let out a cry of joy, throwing his arms around his mother. Alicia sank into his embrace, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. I told you, baby, she whispered through sobs. I told you I'd come back. Across the room, Richard exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief surged through him, mingled with a deep respect for the strength Alicia had carried through every step of this ordeal. Detective Sanderson sat quietly in the back, his expression unreadable. When the judge adjourned, he rose and slipped out without waiting for thanks or recognition. He knew his career had likely reached its end, but he also knew he had chosen the right side. Officer Ruiz, standing near the doorway, caught Richard's eye and offered a faint smile as if to say, "Not everyone in this system is blind." As Alicia left the courtroom, reporters swarmed, microphones and cameras thrust in her face, but this time she didn't lower her head in shame. She walked tall, Jamal at her side, her voice steady as she said, "The truth speaks louder than lies." Richard moved beside her, shielding her from the press as best he could. For once, the spotlight didn't matter. What mattered was that justice had prevailed, and Jamal no longer had to cry out for someone to believe. The battle in court was over, but for Richard, the journey wasn't. As he watched Alicia lead her son through the crowd, he knew this story was not just about a single case. It was about everything that came after. The courthouse steps were crowded, but Alicia walked with her head high, Jamal's hand held firmly in hers. The reporters still shouted, cameras still flashed, but their noise no longer carried the sting of accusation. Instead, it felt like a backdrop to something larger, a moment of triumph carved out of injustice. Richard stayed close, his tall frame shielding them from the worst of the frenzy. He watched Alicia's composure with admiration. She didn't shrink under the weight of attention. She carried it with dignity, as though refusing to let the world see her as anything less than whole. Later, when the chaos had quieted, Richard invited Alicia and Jamal to meet him at his foundation's office. The building, sleek and modern, stood in contrast to the precinct they had endured just nights earlier. He led them into a sunlit conference room, where Eleanor waited with files neatly stacked before her. "I didn't bring you here to offer charity," Richard began, sensing Alicia's guarded expression. "I brought you here because I see strength in you, strength I want this foundation to reflect. We help families who face unfair odds, but we need leaders who understand that struggle firsthand." Alicia crossed her arms, still cautious. "You want me to work for you?" Richard shook his head. "Not for me." "With me, a leadership role. You'd shape programs, guide outreach, make decisions. Your voice matters more than mine in this space." Jamal's eyes lit up. "Mom, you could help other people like us." Alicia looked at her son, then back at Richard. Her pride resisted, but her heart recognized the sincerity in his offer. Slowly, she nodded. "All right. But only if I earn it like anyone else." Richard smiled faintly. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." In the weeks that followed, Alicia became a driving force at the foundation. Her ideas reshaped projects, focusing not just on financial aid, but on mentorship, education, and advocacy. She carried herself with the same determination that had sustained her through endless hospital shifts. now channeled into building opportunities for others. For Jamal, life began to shift too. With the case behind them, he found stability at school. Richard visited often, taking him to robotics club meetings, listening to him explain his projects with enthusiasm. The boy's laughter grew freer, his shoulders less burdened. One evening, as they left the foundation together, Jamal looked up at Richard. "Do you think I could be an engineer one day?" Richard rested a hand on his shoulder. "I don't just think you can, I think you will. And when you do, you'll change the world in ways I can't even imagine." For Richard, the journey had given him something he hadn't expected, a chance at redemption. He couldn't erase the distance with his daughter Emily or the regrets that haunted him. But through Alicia and Jamal, he had found a way to turn guilt into action, to step into the mess of real life instead of watching from the sidelines. On the foundation's wall, a new motto was inscribed under Alicia's guidance: "Every voice matters. Every family deserves justice." Richard read it often, each word a reminder of the night he had heard a boy's desperate cry and chosen not to walk away. Standing in the conference room months later, he addressed a group of new volunteers. His voice carried the weight of lived truth. "This work isn't about saving people. It's about standing with them, fighting alongside them, and refusing to let the world look away." Jamal and Alicia stood in the back, watching quietly. Their smiles said more than words ever could. Before we close this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful journeys like this one. And if you want to keep watching, click on the video suggested on your screen. You won't want to miss it.